Video games have explored a lot of different business practices over the years. We've got things like DLC, where companies can add more content into a game after it's already been released. Microtransactions and loot boxes, which are more or less gambling and have even affected legislature in certain countries as a result. We've had the introduction of early access games, which is basically a way for a company to say, hey, we have something that kind of works, but we don't have enough money to finish it, so give us like $30 and you get to play the alpha. Pretty please? Finally, there's the practice that we're talking about today, making separate versions of the same game. Now, making different versions of a product, with each version having exclusive content, is not anything new, nor is it something that's restricted to the video game industry. Comic books sell variant covers of certain issues to encourage collectors to buy the same book multiple times. Some movies, like Clue and Wolverine Origins, have had slightly different endings to experiment to show in different theaters in order to encourage rewatches of the film and to increase discussion about them. And then there's toys with different colors, holographic trading cards. In every case, it's slightly different, but ultimately it's the same motive. Somebody wants you to buy the same thing twice. But for now, due to the nature of what this channel is, let's just focus on one thing, that being video games. Making separate versions of video games has been a practice for a long time, with varying models for how it's done. But today I'm just going to be focusing on two models, which I will be calling the same but different model and the different but similar model. Keep in mind that I'm not talking about updated re-releases of games, and I'm also not talking about timed exclusives, which is basically where a company will get the right to have exclusive content in their version of the game before a certain amount of time passes, and then everyone else can have it. All I'm talking about today is when a company has a game that has two different versions of itself and is specifically marketed as such. Games like these, for example, which I will be talking about at length and spoiling, so keep that in mind if you want to play them. And as always, this is all opinion. It's just my feelings on the matter. If you want to agree or disagree, great. If you want to talk about it, even better. But do yourself a favor and wait until the end. Now then, let's talk about, do games need separate versions? Who are you? Oh, hi, I'm Tall Fox Blue. Tall Fox Red. I just picked this out of the closet. I don't identify with it chromatically. What are you doing? Well, I'm making the same video that you are, but my video is going to be posted on Vimeo. That seems like a horrible and on-the-nose use of allegory. Welcome to Tall Fox.
I wanna be the very best, like no one ever was.
Whenever somebody thinks about a video game that has two versions of itself, regardless of whatever model it is, their mind will almost always go to one place first: Pokemon. And it's not hard to see why. Pokemon is probably one of the most successful and well-known video game franchises to come out in the past 30 years. It is a series completely built around merchandising and sticking itself in every single orifice in a media that can be allowed to slap a picture of a yellow lightning rat onto it. That's not hyperbole either. Pokemon was, and to an extent still is, in everything. Television, trading cards, household merchandise. But let's never forget its origins, video games. The first Pokemon games that were ever released came out in Japan in 1996, Pocket Monsters Aka and Midori, or Pokemon Red and Green as English speakers would come to call them. When they were successful, the games were reprogrammed and updated before getting an international release 2 years later as Pokemon Red and Blue. Shortly after that, the English version of the anime started to air in the West. Another enhanced version of the game was released called Pokemon Yellow Pikachu Edition, and the rest, as they say, is history. Begun, the collect-em-all wars had, as our parents looked on in bewilderment at how cartoons of elemental critters had somehow completely enveloped their children and would create a worldwide phenomenon of embarrassment and annoyed parents of having to sit through Pokemon-themed birthday parties and being dragged to see Pokemon the first movie. Just a little fun anecdote, I recently found out from my dad that when he took me and my older brother to go see Pokemon the first movie, he actually managed to get a pair of free tickets from some other dad that was there and had 2 extra. This meant that my father had to go to the ticket booth and say, "1 ticket for the Pokemon movie, please," by himself. Thanks, Dad. I love you. Back on topic, the first generation of Pokemon set a precedent for the series that would be followed into the modern day. Two different versions of a game, followed by an enhanced version that was somehow better than the previous two. That last part has actually changed in recent years, with now the third version of the game now being a sequel with another pair of versions to go with it, taking place in the same region as the previous game, but continuing the region's story with some additional Pokemon thrown in. The two versions of each game are almost always identical in appearance. They play the same, deal with the same characters, and overall have very few differences. The main thing that separates them is usually what types of Pokemon you can catch in each game. For example, you can get a Scyther in red version, but not in blue version, whereas you can get a Magmar in blue, but not in red. And then later games would set the trend of making it so you could only get certain legendaries in each version. Given that the tagline for Pokemon is, "Gotta catch 'em all," you can see why this would create a conundrum. The only way that you could obtain all the Pokemon in the game is by trading with someone that had the other version. But why was this even so? Why did Game Freak and Nintendo decide to take a game and split it into two separate versions to begin with? What was the thought process there? Okay, yeah, well besides that. The answer is the Game Boy, Nintendo's first handheld console. The handheld console that people still reference today when they need to think about early mobile gaming. Handheld gaming was revolutionary when it first came out. The only way to play video games before that time was to plug your gaming console into a TV and play at home. If you were on a long car trip or riding the bus, or if your mom made you go play outside, you were SOL. If you wanted to play at a friend's house, you had to pack up the entire system and lug it over there while hoping you didn't forget any of your cables at home. Handheld gaming changed all of that. Now, you could have a video game on you wherever you went. But probably one of the most standout capabilities of this new mobile gaming era was the link-up capability that people could perform between handhelds. Game Boys especially were well regarded for their link capability. No, not that one. We're going to talk about him later. If two people had two copies of the same game, two Game Boys, and a link cable, they could connect their systems and play together. And it might be hard to imagine now, considering we have the internet where literally everything is connected, but this was a big freaking deal at the time. Probably the only thing that came close in that time period were LAN parties, and the average person neither wanted to bother with that or knew how to make it work, plus you would still be lugging a ton of equipment around. Now you could play with your friends everywhere and with minimal setup, and the development of Pokemon took full advantage of that. Pokemon was made with the Game Boy in mind. Everything about it was tailored to this handheld console. You could take it with you to show your friends what new critters you had caught over the weekend, you could battle each other to see who's made the stronger team, and most importantly, you could trade Pokemon so that you could catch them all. Everything about Pokemon was made to take advantage of what the Game Boy had to offer, and it worked. Pokemon was a breakaway success and is one of Nintendo's most successful properties in decades. It is still one of the most successful media franchises of all time. People bought Game Boys specifically so that they could play Pokemon, and the different versions of the game played a huge part in that. And naturally, this influenced the competing market as well. All of a sudden, other games from other developers started to borrow from Pokemon's successful model. Games that had multiple versions of themselves but were otherwise identical to each other, to encourage people to either buy multiple copies of the game or to buy different versions with their friends so that they could link up and trade. This model is still successful for Pokemon, which is why it hasn't gone away, even if other developers have dropped it. But then again, it's not the only model available for games that want separate versions. The other major use of different versions when it comes to video games involves making games that are similar in name only. Games that might deal with the same characters and setting, but telling a completely different story altogether. It's basically if you took a game that split itself into different routes like Resident Evil or Sonic Rush, but instead of putting those two routes into one game, you separated them and made people pay for them twice. The earliest example of a game that I can think of using this model is actually with Nintendo's Legend of Zelda series, with the Oracle of Seasons and Ages games. No, the CDI games don't count. We don't talk about those. We just meme them. These were a pair of games on the Game Boy Color set to the same engine as an earlier Game Boy game, Link's Awakening. In these games, you play as yet another version of Link trying to save a pretty girl from evil, but this time in different hair colors. At first glance, it was easy for people to compare the Oracle games to Pokemon, if only because it was a game with two different versions. But if you actually played the games, you'd realize how wrong that was. The Oracle games, while similar, almost completely stood on their own from each other. The games had different plots, different settings, different bosses, dungeons, items, you name it. They were even thematically different gameplay-wise, with Seasons being more action-oriented and Ages focusing more on puzzle solving. For all intents and purposes, it really seemed that despite being released at the same time and being set in the same series, Oracle of Seasons and Ages were completely different games and were not connected in any significant way. That was, however, until you actually beat them. After you complete Oracle of Seasons or Ages, you're treated to a final cutscene where the real master behind the plot, the witch's twin Rova, have an Inspector Gadget-style "We'll get you next time, Gadgets" scene, and then you get a password. You can then use that password or use the Game Boy's link cable to connect to the other Oracle game when starting a new game, at which point the game will act as a sequel with characters recognizing Link from the previous game, and you'll also get to confront Twin Rova after the final boss to save Princess Zelda, and then have your series' regular final battle with Ganon. So with this in mind, neither Oracle game was truly complete on their own. Yes, for the most part they stood apart by having distinct styles, and there were plenty of things that separated them from each other. They weren't like Pokemon, where the only difference was what collectibles you could get, but they were still incomplete by themselves. To get true closure on these games, you had to play both. Or you had to have a friend who had the code, or nowadays I guess you could just look up that code online. This model doesn't get used as often, probably because it's a lot of work and bears a great deal of risk. But the Oracle games were not the last series of games to do this. In fact, we could find an easy example in the last few years, and one that I've talked about on this channel: Fire Emblem Fates. Fire Emblem Fates was a game that had 3 different versions of it, 2 being able to purchase in retail, and the last one being downloadable. Unless you were one of the lucky 5 people that somehow got the special edition that had all 3 on one cartridge. In a way, Fates was very similar to the Oracle games, a comparison that I've made in the past. They were games with 3 different scenarios that were similar, but handled various things in different ways, specifically in their difficulty, gameplay, and story. Playing Birthright would not give you the same experience of playing Conquest, nor would it Revelation. The games were supposed to look at the setting from a different angle by having Corrin choose which of his family to side with, or decide with neither of them and look for a third option. In the end, they'll end up following a path that varies depending on who they swore allegiance to. But again, this is much different from the Pokemon model, because in Pokemon you'll always end up in the same location by the end of the game, even if you might have fought slightly different battles to get there. Fates didn't do that, with the end of each conflict having different results, albeit with similar elements and faces. So to that end, it wouldn't be unfair to call the 3 versions of Fates 3 different games. But what about the reason we're here? What about the reason for this video? So now that we've examined what these 2 models of making separate versions of games are, let's answer the question: should games have separate versions? Well, for me, no. But I do find one model more acceptable than the other. In the case of Model A, same but different, I would say sure, I guess. I don't hate the separate versions of games like Pokemon, and I think it works exceptionally well for that specific style of game. Pokemon has, and always will be, a social experience. Just about every main game in the series, in some fashion, encourages people to play with each other, to battle, to trade, and just to have fun with each other. I do like being able to look at a pair of games that are coming out and say, okay, well I'm going to get this one that has Satan Phoenix on it, so which of my friends is getting the one with Dear Jesus? But the great thing about this model is that if you don't want to experience that social aspect, you can usually do so and get a solid experience from the game. The game is still made in a way that it can be played on its own. Sure, you'll miss out on certain Pokemon since you won't be able to get them without trading, but there will never be a moment where you reach the end of the game, complete it, and then feel like the developer only sold you half the product and you're still waiting on the rest of it. There's no lingering shot of a side character evilly smiling into the camera to imply that you didn't get the complete ending, or that there's still more things to do. Anything you do after that is just icing on the cake. The only thing that kind of rubs me the wrong way about this model is that it seems a little unfair to the 100% completionists to lock that particular aspect of the game behind the other version, and forcing them to trade with people or just buy the same game twice. But at the same time, I'm not a 100% completionist, so I can't relate to it on a personal level. In my personal experience, I have never beaten a Pokemon and felt like it was missing something vital that required me to spend more money. But moving on, should we still have games on Model B? Different but same? No. Look, I've already made my opinion on Fate's Gnome, so if you want something more in-depth but with worse audio quality, you can just go watch my review on it. There are some things about Fates that I'm very iffy about, even if I did enjoy it overall, but the game being split into 3 paths that you have to pay for individually was always my biggest complaint. It wouldn't be a big issue if Birthright and Conquest could stand on their own, but they can't, at least not story-wise. So there's stuff that happens in both games that are basically just advertisements for the third. It's like, oh hey, did you like this game? Did you have a good time? Do you want closure? Do you want to know who these invisible guys were? $20, pay up. Unfortunately, this was an issue with the Oracle games as well. For the entirety of the Oracle games, it felt like you were on this self-contained adventure. No Zelda, no Ganon, nothing to even do with the sister game that had been released along with it. Then, once the day is won and the credits roll, bam! Guess what? Turns out the story's not over. Now, there's all these guys in the overworld talking about how they're waiting on secrets, or how there's still more to do. Guess you gotta play the other game to get that. It's not that these things diminish my love for these games either. The Oracle games are some of my favorite Zelda games. They're tons of fun and I love them to death, though I do recall liking Seasons a bit more than Ages, for reasons. But even then, this was always a sour note for me, even as a kid. You get to the end and you're told that you're not done. Evil is still out there and quite frankly, you kinda played into its hands in a way. You moron. So if you never buy the other game or never connect it in some way, you'll never have truly won. That's kind of a shitty feeling to put on a kid. To have them jump hoops, fight evil, save the day, but then tell them that they didn't really win. I don't hate the idea of having 2 separate versions of a game, but in this case, I only really appreciate the Pokemon model because I feel like it has the potential to play more on the social aspect of the game, regardless of the original intent and regardless of whether or not it's a cash grab. At the end of the day, I want my feeling at the end of the game to be one of fulfillment and closure. If I play the game again at that point, it's because I want to and because I want to revisit things, not because I feel obligated to. Thanks for watching. See you next time. This isn't going to be a recurring thing, is it? This whole 2-video thing? It probably just depends on whether or not this video does well, but to be honest, I don't see much of a future for either of us, not with the existence of Tall Fox Black. Get ready for the true ending, assholes.
But some experts say the entire Pokemon phenomenon is the enemy.
In my opinion, parents should not let their kids watch Pokemon, play Pokemon, buy Pokemon cards, have anything whatsoever to do with Pokemon, because the message is violence.
But that psychiatrist who had that quote last, that how bad Pokemon is, I guarantee you these people haven't seen any of the cartoons at all. They have no concept at all.